with Tertullian.
All right.
But Tertullian is going to be arguing against a particular heretic. A heretic by the name of Marcion. Marcion of Sinope. Do you know who he is, Logic?
Yep. Marcion was, he thought that the Old Testament God was evil, did not like the Old Testament, rejected it, and only picked certain parts of the gospel, specifically Luke, that he liked and distorted into things of this nature.
Very good. And so what he does, what Tertullian does in one of his books, is the book of Against Marcion, book 4. So this, I tell you what, these people just love to write. Because he wrote 4 books against Marcion. So in Against Marcion, book 4, chapter 2, he argues against Marcion.
Which email is this in that you sent me?
It's in the first one. It's in the first one.
I see Tertullian, Prescription Against Heretics, chapters 32 and 36.
So that's Prescription Against Heretics, chapter 2 and 36. But there's also, if you look in the Gospel Lists section.
The Gospel Lists.
Before you continue, guys, after you do this, there is a thing that I want to take you through with
found it.
Just to...
while you're looking that. What's up, Sid?
Oh, yeah, so... Just before, don't worry, I'm not going to pause anything, guys, but after this, I will take you through memorization of the Bible, briefly, and Augustine, and the way he fantastically and famously uses apostolic succession in his argument against a very specific heretic. You guys cook when you finish, you know what I'm saying? You might do.
We got you, fam.
I'll still be here, don't worry, I'll still be here.
We gonna say some good stuff for you, bro. Don't worry about it. So here Tertullian's arguing against Marcion, and one of the things that he points out, it's sort of the same claim that these modern scholars and these Muslims try to throw at us, and Tertullian uses that same accusation against Marcion. So here, he talks about Luke's gospel, or even before then, he lists the gospels for us. So he says, you have now our answer to the antithesis, compendiously indicated by us. I pass on to give a proof of the gospel, not to be sure of Jewry, but of Pontus. Having become meanwhile unadulterated, this shall indicate the order by which we proceed. We lay it down as our first position, that the evangelical testament, the Gospels, has apostles for its authors, to whom was assigned by the Lord himself this office of publishing the gospel. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Since, however, there are apostolic men also, they are yet not alone, but appear with apostles and after apostles, because the preaching of the disciples might be open to the suspicion of an affectation of glory, if there did not accompany it the authority of the masters, which means that of Christ. For it was that which made the apostles their masters. So even the gospels that we have coming from the apostolic men were written in the presence of apostles, so that they didn't slap their own names on it. Those were given by the heads, by their successors, or by their predecessors. He says, of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instill faith into us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards. These all start with the same principles of the faith, so far as it rests to the one and only God, the Creator, and his Christ, how that he was born of the Virgin and came to fulfill the law and the prophets. Never mind if there does occur some variation in the order of the narratives, provided that there be agreement on the essential matter of the faith, in which there is disagreement with Marcion. Now let's stop here. He establishes that the authors, again, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he says, even if you will try to say that there are narrative variations there, they agree on the sum and substance of the narratives.
Now again, Tertullian is writing when?
He's writing around 200.
So around 200, we already have an agreement that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote their Gospels before the Council of Nicaea.
Yep.
I thought this was made up at the Council of Nicaea, so how could Tertullian do this?
Because, boy, they lying.
They lying, man. They lying.
You see. I have a guy named Dat Boy, and I love him because he has an Arab name. So I mean, he has his last name is Ben. So I'll just call him by his Arab name. That boy been lying. That boy be stay lying.
Wow.
It's crazy, bro.
He really did that, y'all. Wow, that boy been lying, man. He everywhere. So just really quick, just to do this again, he says, of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instilled faith into us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards. John, Matthew, Luke, Mark.
Correct.
The authors of our Gospels. All right, let's keep going.
And you know it's crazy because he then says something crazy. He says, Marcion, on the other hand, you must know, ascribes no author to his gospel. It's Marcion's gospel that did not have a name attached to it. He then says, as if it could not be allowed him to affix a title to that which it was no crime in his eyes to subvert the very body. And here I might now make a stand and contend that a work ought not to be recognized, which does not hold its head erect, its head upright, which exhibits no consistency, which gives no promise of credibility from the fullness of its title and the just profession of its author. In contrast to Marcion, the Gospels, if anything's got to be received, it's got to have a name.
It's got to have a name.
If it didn't have a name, it wouldn't be accepted in the churches.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't have done it. So here, this is the argument that our Muslim friends and our modern scholars try to make. That apparently these four Gospels were just, written by who knows what. They didn't have a name attached to them, and then they were just given by the church saying, hey, use these. And for the past 300 years, everybody's just said, okay. We're just going to use them. We're going to quote them. We're going to carry these things to our martyrdom. Does that make any sense?
Now, here's also something interesting, because there's an objection here. We got, I think, a Mohammedan in here,
sure,
who says exactly, so they invented a name to give it authoritative power. Now, Sig, quickly, succinctly, touch on this, this idea that they invented names to the gospel accounts in order to give them authoritative power. Would we expect to see names like Mark or Luke if they wanted authority?
Nah, see, the basic idea is the people that were the most authoritative, put very simply, were the 12. Yeah. So anyone in the first list of the 12, those are the guys you're going to look to and be like, yeah, those are great. Now, he makes a good point. And if you wanted people to make a legit gospel, you would just stick on a name of one of the important guys, which is what we do see with literally every other non-canonical gospel.
Like Peter and Thomas and Mary Magdalene.
And Mary. So you mean to tell me that people were making up writings and sticking on these
all the time.
Names?
Yeah, all the time. In fact, what they would do is, and this is funny, Irenaeus argues against this as well. Because they rejected the Bible, they rejected the Gospels, Irenaeus said, okay, but we have the tradition of the apostles. What those guys would do is say, oh, well, we have our own tradition. Irenaeus would ask, okay, how? That's how he would be very confused. Like, how would you do this? They straight up just made their own book and said that this made sense now. Now, how do we know that they made their own book up and it now does not make any sense? Because the guy that you're saying wrote the text died horrifically hundreds of years before the book was codified. So the Gospel of Judas, hundreds of years later, earliest dating, not latest, earliest dating. Gospel of Thomas, 2nd century. Thomas died in India in the 1st century. He's not writing anything, right? It's just not possible. It's not feasible. Now, if I was trying to make the canonical Gospels, why the hell would I put someone that wasn't part of the 12 apostles? Why, like maybe Mark, disciple of Peter. Peter's great, and then maybe a little chain connection there. Why would I put Luke? Luke is the most Pauline guy in history. Like, he makes a whole half of the Acts of the Apostles is on Peter, the other half is on Paul. Paul loves Luke so much he calls Luke's writing scripture. Like, it's a whole thing. So why would I choose Luke? Doesn't make sense unless Luke was telling the truth in the prologue. Luke says, hey, many people tried to write a gospel, and in fact it was good. Now, what this shows is that there were good gospels already being written, evidence for Matthew or Mark already existing. But Luke says, I followed everything for the beginning, and I'm writing an orderly account for you. Now, what you'll notice is in the debate, and this is very important, God logic, in the debate on the non-canonical gospels, not a single academic ever tries to date the non-canonical gospels any earlier than the 2nd century. Yet there is such a fierce debate on the 1st century dating of the gospels, because there's something about the gospels that we call the gospels that forces us to have that conversation. The evidence for the gospels being 1st century are very, very explicit. The evidence for the gospel being written by certain people, attributed to certain people, very explicit. You don't have that for those people. In fact, you have evidence of their absence. You simply have evidence of their absence.
Wow. So, even though people, this idea, this is why they just make up names and just add them on their gospel to give them authority, we actually see the Gnostics and the heretics doing that.
Yeah.
Right?
All the time.
Putting these authoritative names on there and being rejected and called out on it and caught, cooked when they lie about this.
Yeah, dude, they made a Gospel of Judas.
Exactly.
Right.
So while we have where less authoritative people, less popular people are acknowledged as the gospel writers, like Mark and Luke, instead of just, why don't you just say Peter? Why don't you just say who else was in there, man?
Philip.
Thomas was really
Thomas, Andrew.
Andrew. Bartholomew, Simon the Zealot.
Barnabas.
Barnabas.
The Gospel of Barnabas, man.
I mean, what's interesting with that whole Barnabas thing is interesting, because what we do have, the very best attestation we have to anything written by Barnabas is a letter called the Epistle of Barnabas, where he talks about the fact that Christ died. So, very simply, the Barnabas that we do know said that he died.
Now, it refers it to Old Testament prophecy too.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting?
It's funny. It's funny because Tertullian actually takes on that argument too. Of what if they just slap these names on?
You can.
He continues to say in this very same text. Now the authors whom we possess, Marcion sees to have singled out Luke for his mutilating process. He doesn't even make something up. He takes what we have and then mutilates it.
Yeah.
Luke, however, was not an apostle, but only an apostolic man. Not a master, but a disciple. And so, inferior to a master, and less as far subsequent to him as the apostle to whom he followed was subsequent to the others. So that, had Marcion even published his gospel in the name of St. Paul himself, the single authority of that document, destitute of all support from preceding authorities, would not be a sufficient basis for our faith. There would still be wanted that gospel which St. Paul found in existence, to which he yielded his belief, and which he so earnestly wished his own to agree, that he actually, on that account, went up to Jerusalem to know and consult the apostles, lest he should run or had been running in vain. In other words, that the faith which he had learned and the gospel which he was preaching might be in accordance with theirs.
Yeah.
Then, at last, having conferred with the primitive authors and having agreed with them touching the rule of faith, they joined their hands in fellowship and divided their labors thenceforth in the office of preaching the gospel, so that they were going to go to the Jews, and St. Paul to the Jews and the Gentiles. Inasmuch, therefore, as the enlightener of St. Luke himself desired the authority of his predecessors for both his own faith and preaching, how much more may I not require for Luke's gospel that which was necessary for the gospel of his master?
Yeah.
Wow. So breaking this down, Tertullian, speaking of Luke, acknowledging him as not directly an apostle, but an apostolic man, right? Traveled with the apostle Paul and witnessed things and, all this kind of stuff, was his companion. And because him following his predecessor, who was Paul, the one who he followed, was so serious and intricate when it came to his gospel and his revelation, that even Paul had to make sure it lined up with the apostles and what they preached. Paul made sure that he was not out of line with the apostles, went to Jerusalem, talked with them, touched the bases, and said, all right, we good. Just to make sure I'm not running this race in vain. Mm-hmm. That I haven't been preaching in vain. Because I could have been preaching. If it didn't line up with what y'all was teaching, I would have been out of line and preaching a false message. Yeah. Paul, this is Paul's mindset. Mm-hmm. So if even Paul has this mindset, Tertullian is saying, Luke has this mindset when it comes to his gospel. And for Luke to have this mindset for his gospel, which is followed by Paul, Marcion, you have to have this mindset, which you don't. You have no link, no connection with the apostles. You don't even have a freaking name for your gospel.
Yeah.
Not one.
Now, here's something that's very important, because there are many Christians that are thinking, oh, maybe the church fathers were independently making these things up, or maybe they're just hearing stuff and it's like hearsay. Take 5 seconds to understand how the early church recorded their history, which is why women are very important in the early church. The early Christians created what we call libraries today. And all across the Roman Empire, these large Christian libraries were centers of intellectual fortitude, as well as historical notation of the Christian age. We have libraries in Jerusalem, Caesarea, Turkey, Rome, for example, the Vatican libraries. We have libraries in Hippo, Tagaste, where Augustine was very popular. These church libraries were so important that they actually were used by fathers in the 3rd century to record what was going on in the 2nd and 1st. Cyprian of Carthage, in his 3 books of testimonies against the Jews, not even before he begins the work, in the preface, he says this: more strength will be given to you, the reader, and the intelligence of the heart will be affected more and more as you examine more fully the scriptures, old and new, and read through, listen, the complete volumes of the spiritual books. Now, this isn't referring to New Testament texts, because in Cyprian's day, the term scripture now means both Old and New Testament. That understanding is now held. This is referring to other spiritual texts that were passed down. What's interesting as well is even as late, now bear in mind, the later this is, the better. As late as the 500s AD, these church libraries still existed, and they're only increasing in size. Gregory the Dialogist, right? Gregory the Great, in his Register of Letters, Book 8, Letter 29, he says this to the Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. Bear in mind, the Library of Alexandria, that very famous library, church documents. This is what he says: I am not aware of any collections in the archives of this our church, or in the libraries, multiple, of the city of Rome, unless it be few things collected in a single volume. So they're having a dispute about certain things collected in their libraries, their archives, just different works. We indeed have the names of almost every single martyr, with their deaths assigned to particular days, collected in a single book. and we celebrate the solemnities of Mass on such days in commemorations of them. So this is what the church in Rome had at the time. In just one book, they have the names of almost every single martyr in their province. Yet it isn't indicated in this single volume who each person was and how he suffered, so like a detail of their life, but only his name, the place, and the day that he died. So we know who he was, where he died, and when he died. Hence, it results that many of the various countries and provinces, so different church communities with their own libraries, are known to have been crowned with martyrdom. Now listen to this, as I've said through the several days. But these, so all this extra information, we believe you have. So as far as the 5th century, in Alexandria, especially in the East, they had libraries dedicated to preserving church history. Jerome, when he makes a huge book, a biography of many of these people that we reference today, Tertullian, Polycarp, Irenaeus, he talks about all of them. Jerome says, is the fault here mine? Is it my fault that I'm doing this? Or am I responsible for harshness? Compared with the sentence of Pierius, a person that was prosecuted in his time, all that I have ever written is really mild, because people were complaining about what Jerome was writing. He says, consult the commentaries of the above named writers that I've talked about and take advantage of the church libraries. Because the person he was writing to, Panachius, wanted to do something similar to Jerome and create a history of early Christianity. He says, look, I got prosecuted for doing stuff like this, but if you want to do it, go to the church libraries. Eusebius, Jerome, many patristic authors used the church libraries to record points of important history. And anyone at that time could have gone to that church and, opened up the documents and read, like, what was going on. So we have them preserved in libraries. Now, again, these libraries take time to build. When no one's saying that, oh, boom, huge building. But they were kept in small church groups. And then as time went on, you were able to preserve them in libraries. Now, God Logic, if you'll permit me, there was something that I wanted to talk about here, if that's okay.